She came to Montana on a mail-order bride ticket and was rejected before she even stepped off the platform. But the letter that turned her away wasn't written by the man she was meant to marry. It was written by the man who wanted him dead. Somewhere in the snow-covered mountains of 1878, a dying stranger is hiding a tin box under his floorboard, and inside it is proof that could bring down a railroad empire built on stolen land and poisoned tea. A widow with an ink-stained ledger and a mountain man with nothing left to lose. Stay right here, because this story is about what happens when the truth finally finds someone brave enough to carry it home. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, share it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
The stagecoach did not stop for Abigail Mercer. It simply rid itself of her. The iron-rimmed wheels ground into the gray Montana mud, throwing up a spray of grit that spotted the hem of her traveling skirt. The driver didn't climb down. He merely unlatched the back boot, dropped her black leather valise into the dirt, and tossed a small square envelope onto the wooden planks of the Ridgeway platform. "End of the line, ma'am," he said, squinting through the early winter flurries. "Watch your step." Then the whip cracked. The team lunged forward, and the coach rolled into the gray mist, leaving Abby standing alone in the sharp, high-altitude wind. She did not move for a long time. She stood on the unplaned pine boards of the station, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly over her black wool cloak. Around her, Ridgeway smelled of wet pine, horse manure, and cheap coal smoke. A dozen men lounged outside the livery, across the dirt road lumberjacks, with mud on their boots and skin like tanned hide. They stared. A woman traveling alone in 1878 was a curiosity. A woman traveling alone with a Philadelphia posture was an entertainment. Abby ignored them. She let her face remain completely still, a habit learned through 9 years of a marriage where her expressions were constantly edited by another man's disapproval. She looked down at the envelope by her boots. A man stepped out from the shadows of the telegraph office. He wore an expensive wool coat, a silk neckerchief, and boots that had never seen a shovel. He picked up the letter, dusted the mud off it with a slow, deliberate thumb, and held it out to her. "Mrs. Mercer, I presume?" His voice was smooth, carrying the distinct, cold polish of an East Coast education. "I am the local agent for Mr. Thaddeus Vance. I believe this belongs to you." Abby took the envelope. She broke the wax seal with a steady fingernail. Inside, the ink was fresh, the handwriting crude, signed in the name of Jedediah Coulter. "Hui, Hon Ook." It read in brutal, broken sentences. "I have seen your likeness from the agency. I need a young, strong bride to pull a plow and clear the timber, not a faded widow from the city. Do not come up the mountain." A low laugh rippled through the men gathered outside the livery. The agent had read it before she did. The whole town had probably read it before it was sealed. They looked at her, waiting for the tears, waiting for the Philadelphia lady to collapse onto her knees in the dirt. Abby carefully folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. She looked the agent dead in the eye. Her chin did not tremble. Her shoulders did not a fraction of an inch. "Is there a boarding house in this town, sir?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying across the muddy road. The agent blinked, his patronizing smile faltering just a bit. "Martha Prayer keeps rooms down the block. But surely, ma'am, a woman in your position rejected, without a protector, should take the next coach back to the railhead." Abby picked up her heavy valise herself, the leather handle cold against her palm. "My position, Mr. Vance's agent, is exactly what I choose it to be," Abby said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, steady cadence. "A letter can change a plan, but it cannot change a person. A woman's dignity is not a piece of land to be claimed or abandoned by a man's signature. It belongs to her. It stays with her whether she is welcomed or whether she is turned away. She stepped off the wooden platform, her boots sinking deep into the cold Montana mud. She walked toward the town, her head held high, leaving the agent standing alone in the snow. Martha Prayer-ass boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage, yellow soap, and old iron. Martha herself was 67, with white hair pulled back so tight it smoothed the wrinkles on her forehead. She looked at Abby's sun-edged valise, then at the black leather journal tucked under Abby's arm, and finally at the mud on her skirts. $2 a week, Martha said, leaning her palms flat against the kitchen table. Paid in advance, no men in the rooms after sundown, no loud praying. Abby opened her small velvet purse. She counted out 2 silver dollars, the coins heavy and cold, and laid them on the table. She had exactly $12 left. I was told Jedediah Coulter lived 4 miles up the timberline, Abby said quietly. Martha picked up the silver, her old eyes sharp. He lives there, alone, grew up in the high country. Gremio calls him a poor mountain man. Nothing but a dirt floor and an axe to his name. But Jed Coulter didn't write that letter you're holding in your pocket, child. Abby paused. How do you know I have a letter? This town has 300 people in one road, Martha said, turning back to her iron pot. Secrets don't keep out here. They freeze and snap. Vance S. men want Jed's mountain. They've wanted it for 3 years. If a mail-order bride shows up and goes home crying, it makes Jed look like a brute. Makes the town think he's dangerous. A man who stands alone on a mountain is an obstruction to progress, Mrs. Mercer. And progress out here has very sharp teeth. Abby nodded slowly. She didn't ask for pity, and Martha didn't offer any. That was the first true mercy Abby had felt since leaving Pennsylvania. In her tiny room on the 2nd floor, Abby sat on the edge of the straw-stuffed mattress. The room was freezing, the wind whistling through the unchinked logs in the corner. She opened her black leather journal. She did not write about her grief, or her late husband, James, or the humiliation at the station. Instead, she dipped her steel-nibbed pen into the inkwell and wrote in neat, precise ledger lines, October 12, 1878. Ridgeway, Montana, room rent, 2 remaining funds. 10. Observation. The letter was a forgery. Thaddeus Vance's agent wanted me to leave. Therefore, I must stay. She closed the book with a soft thud. She looked at her hands. They were thin, the skin pale from years of city living. But the fingers were nimble, trained by hours of delicate needlework, and the careful handling of her husband's accounting papers. She stood up, walked to the small wash basin, and washed the mountain mud from her face. She did not look in the mirror. She didn't need to know what she looked like. She needed to know what she was going to do. The trail up the timberline was not built for walking. It was built for mules and heavy logs. Abby walked it anyway. The next morning was clear, the sky a hard, cruel blue that made the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains look like broken glass. She wore her sturdiest boots, her black cloak wrapped twice around her chest. Each breath tasted like ice. 4 miles, her lungs burned, her calves cramped, but every time her knees wanted to buckle, she remembered the low, mocking laugh of the men at the livery station. She remembered James' voice from her past, always telling her what she couldn't understand, what she wasn't strong enough to handle. You are a fragile thing, Abigail, he used to say, his voice soft, his hand firm on her shoulder. Let me think for you. No, Abby said, aloud to the empty pine forest. The sound of her own voice gave her a strange rhythmic strength. Step. Pause, step. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing where the timber had been cut back. It was small, built of rough-hewn larch logs. The roof weighted down with heavy stones to keep the winter winds from ripping the shingles away. No smoke came from the mud and stone chimney. No horse stood in the lean-to. The door was unlatched, swinging a few inches in the cold breeze. Abby approached slowly, her boots crunching on the dry pine needles. "Mr. Coulter," she called out. Only the wind answered. She pushed the door open. The interior was dark, smelling of damp earth, old grease, and something sweet and sickening, the smell of rotting meat. A man lay on the small cot in the corner. He was large, his frame long and muscular, but he was stripped to his shirt, his skin the color of old tallow. A heavy wool blanket was kicked to the floor. His breathing was shallow, rapid, a dry rattling sound in his throat. Abby crossed the dirt floors in 3 quick strides. She dropped her valise and knelt by the cot. She touched his forehead. It was burning, the heat radiating off his skin like an oven. His hair was dark, matted with sweat. His beard was thick, trimmed with the rough hand of a woodsman, but his lips were cracked and bleeding. She pulled back the remaining sheet. His right leg was swollen to twice its size, the trousers torn away at the calf. There, clamped into his flesh, was the jagged, rusted iron jaw of a heavy bear trap. The skin around the iron was black, green at the edges, with red streaks running up toward his thigh. Jedediah Coulter was not rejecting anyone. He was dying. Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't scream, and she didn't run for help. She knew the distance. 4 miles down the mountain meant 2 hours. 2 hours meant the red streaks would reach his heart. She stood up, her movements methodical and calm. She found a bucket of old water by the hearth, a clean hunting knife on the table, and a small box of sulfur matches. She struck a match, the sulfur smell sharp in the cabin air, and held the blade of the knife directly into the flame until the steel turned black, then cherry red. Jed's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, piercing gray, bloodshot with fever. He looked at her, his vision clouded, his hand weakly reaching for the axe on the floor beside him. "Vance," he croaked, his voice like grinding stones. "Get off my land." Abby leaned over him, her small, cool hand pressing firmly against his uninjured shoulder. She used her weight to hold him down, her voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic cadence that brooked no argument. "Be still, Mr. Coulter," she said, looking straight into his wild, fevered eyes. "My name is Abigail Mercer. I am the woman your enemies brought here to ruin you, but I am the only one standing between you and a wooden box." Jed stared up at her, his chest heaving. "Can't pay you. Nothing but dirt." Abby positioned the hot knife over the dark, swollen skin, just above the iron teeth. She looked down at him, her face fierce with a strange, hard grace. "Listen to me, Jedediah Coulter," she said, her voice echoing in the small cabin. "I am not saving you for your coin, or your mountain, or your gratitude. I am saving you because you are a living, breathing human being, and your life has the exact same worth as any railroad king's in the East. Out here, the law might belong to the man with the money, but the right to live belongs to the person who has the strength to fight for it. Now hold on to the frame. This is going to hurt." She pressed the blade into the flesh. Jed hissed, his large hand clamping onto the edge of the wooden cot, till the pine groaned, but he did not scream. He looked at her face, at the sweat on her brow, the absolute focus in her eyes, the total lack of fear, and for the first time in 3 years, the mountain man let someone else carry the weight. The iron teeth did not want to let go. They had bitten deep into Jed Coulter's calf 3 days ago, and the rust had settled into the bone. Abby Mercer knelt in the dirt, her fingers slick with grease and gray mountain mud. She didn't have a blacksmith sleever. She had an old hickory wedge and the flat side of a felling axe. "Don't move, Jed," she whispered. Her breath rose in a white plume against the rafters. The mountain man didn't move. He couldn't. His fingers were embedded in the moss-stuffed cracks between the log walls. His jaw set so hard a trickle of blood ran from his lower lip, where his teeth had pierced it. She set the hickory wedge against the spring of the trap. She swung the axe. Hard. The iron groaned. The spring gave way with a sharp metallic clack that echoed like a pistol shot in the small room. The jaws fell open. Abby didn't look at the blood. She didn't have the luxury of disgust. She took a bottle of high-proof corn, whiskey she'd found under the sink, and poured it directly into the torn flesh. Jed's entire 6-foot frame buckled, his spine arching off the straw mattress. But the only sound he made was a dry, rattling hiss through his nose. "That's the rot coming out," Abby said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, keeping time with her hands as she tore her own linen petticoat into strips. She began to wrap the leg, pulling the linen tight enough to stop the bleeding, but loose enough to let the dark, poisoned fluid drain. "In the city, the doctors give you sugar water and talk about the humors," she said. Her voice dropping into that calm cadence of a woman who had spent 2 years watching her husband die in a room that smelled of expensive cologne and decay. "They think a disease is a moral failing or a bad wind from the river. But out here, Mr. Coulter, the body follows the same rules as the land. If you leave a dead branch on a pine, the rot spreads to the trunk. You have to cut it back. You have to let the clean air get to the roots. Health isn't a secret code. It's just cleanliness and courage." Jed's eyes opened. The gray was cloudy, now, filmed with the first stages of the fever sleep. He looked at her fingers, fast, precise, knotting the linen with the tight, square knots of a sailmaker. "Why?" he rasped, his tongue thick against his teeth. "Why'd you stay?" "Because the man who paid for my ticket wanted me to run," Abby said. She didn't look up from her work. "And I have spent 38 years doing exactly what men paid me to do. I wanted to see what happened if I did the opposite." She stood up, her knees cracking in the silence. The cabin was freezing. The fire in the hearth was nothing but gray ash and 3 charred knots of larch. She walked to the corner, picked up the iron shovel, and began to clear the old coals. For the next 4 hours, Abby Mercer did not think about Philadelphia. She didn't think about the velvet curtains or the silver tea service. Her husband's creditors had taken from her parlor while she was still sewing his shroud fell. She learned the cabin. A house in the territories in 1878 was not a home. It was a machine for staying alive. Every object had a lineage of sweat. The iron kettle had a dent where a mule had kicked it in Nebraska. The pine table was unplaned, the marks of the broadaxe still visible in the grain like frozen waves. "Shang Kwang Kanfang, Moi Tu Deo Noi Ve Mort Muedanom, Song Bankai Katzam, Moi Tu Hong Kan Tiet. Hom Ka Chang, Hom Ka Gung, Hom Ka Sak Tu Mot Kwun King Tang Nyabiada Da Rachnak." She found a sack of coarse cornmeal, a tub of salt pork fat, and a bundle of dried wild sage, hanging from the ridgepole. She built the fire back up. Not with the big logs, those would smoke and choke a sick man, but with the dry bark and the small twigs of mountain mahogany. It burned hot and quick, smelling of flint and sweet resin. She boiled the water. She stirred the cornmeal until it was thick as mud, then dropped 3 leaves of the sage into the pot. "Eat this," she said, sitting back on the 3-legged stool by his cot. Jed turned his head away. "Too hot." "It's not for your taste, Mr. Coulter. It's for your blood," she said. She slid her arm behind his neck, lifting his heavy head with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The skin of his shoulders was rough like hemp rope. The sage dries up the moisture in the lungs when the fever tries to drown you. The cornmeal gives the stomach something to hold on to while the heart does the work. When a man is down out here, his body is like an army under siege. You don't give them sweetmeats. You give them ammunition. He took a spoonful, then another. His throat convulsed as he swallowed, his eyes locked onto her face. "Vance's man," Jed muttered, his voice dropping an octave as the warmth hit his chest. "He told the town you was too old." Abby let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh if she had the time for it. She wiped a smudge of cornmeal from his gray beard with the corner of her apron. "He told the truth," she said. "I am 38. My skin is dry from the East Coast coal dust, and my hands are scarred from the needle. In Philadelphia, a woman past 30 without a husband is considered an expense, a piece of furniture that has lost its polish. But out here, Mr. Coulter, the trees don't care how long they've been in the ground, as long as they hold against the wind. Age isn't a loss of value. It's just more grain in the timber." Jed didn't answer. The sage was working now, his skin turning from the greasy tallow color to a bright, flush red as the sweat broke across his forehead. He fell back against the straw, his breathing deep and heavy. Abby sat in the dark as the mountain night came down. The wind off the peaks didn't blow. It pushed. It hit the larch logs with a heavy, physical weight that made the mud chinking flake off in small white showers onto the dirt floor. She got up every 20 minutes to push the clay back into the cracks with her bare thumb. She opened her black journal by the light of the mahogany coals. "October 13, 1878, she wrote. "The patient's pulse is 80 and full. The infection is localized but deep. Vance S. agents are watching the trail. I found 3 horse tracks near the spring this afternoon. Shod horses, not mountain ponies. They are waiting for him to clear out or die." She looked at Jed. His large hand had fallen off the cot. The fingers curled into the dirt floor as if he were trying to hold the mountain steady while he slept. She reached down, picked up his hand, and placed it back under the wool blanket. His skin was rough, calloused from the axe handle, but it was warm. It felt like living wood. She sat back down on her stool, wrapped her cloak around her ears, and waited for the morning. The third day brought the frost. It grew inside the cabin, a white, furry moss that lined the nailheads in the door and turned the water in the bucket into a solid disk of gray ice. Abby broke the ice with the heel of her boot. She didn't look at her fingers, which were swollen and red from the cold. Jed was awake. The fever had left his eyes, though his face looked thinner. The cheekbones sharp beneath his dark beard, like the ridges of the thunglung outside. "You're using too much wood," he said. His voice was cracked, but the gravel was back in it. "I'm using what's required," Abby replied, without looking up from the hearth where she was, frying 2 strips of salt pork. "If I let the fire die, your blood thickens. A cold room is an invitation to the lung rot, Mr. Coulter. I didn't spend 3 days scraping moo out of your bone to let you freeze like a stray steer in a coulee." Jed moved his leg under the blanket. He winced, but his face remained steady. "You talk like a schoolmarm." "I was a governess for 2 years," she said, sliding the tin plate of pork and fried mush onto the table beside him. "And before that, I was an accountant-s wife. I know how to keep a ledger, and I know how to manage a budget, whether it's in dollars or in logs." She walked over to her valise, which sat in the corner by the flour sack. She reached into the bottom, past the gray wool stockings, and the 3 books of poetry she hadn't opened since Pittsburgh, and pulled out the heavy, brown leather folder. She laid it on the table. The leather was stained with salt water from the Atlantic and grease from the stagecoach springs. "What's that?" Jed asked, watching her with his gray eyes narrowed. "My husband's estate," Abby said. She sat down, her fingers tracing the gold-embossed letters on the cover. James Hayes, certified public accountant, Philadelphia. When he died in the winter of '76, the lawyers told me, he left nothing but a clean name. They said he was an honest man who had been ruined by the bank failures. They were very polite about it. They took the house, they took the carriage, and they left me with his papers because they didn't think paper had any value. She opened the folder. Inside were 40 pages of double-entry bookkeeping, written in a fine, spidery script that looked like dead flies on the parchment. I spent 2 years reading these numbers while I was sewing shirts for 6 cents a collar, she said. Her voice dropped into that rhythmic, low cadence, her thumb tapping against a specific line of red ink. James didn't lose his money in the banks, Mr. Coulter. He gave it away, or rather, someone took it from him. Jed leaned forward, his elbows propping up his heavy chest. What's that got to do with me? Look at the date, she said, turning the ledger toward the cot. March 1875. There is an entry here for $3,000, paid to a firm called Eastern Montana Development. The notation says, for verification of Ridgeway survey maps. And beside it, in the margin, James wrote a name, McCord. The cabin grew very quiet. The only sound was the sharp pop of a pine knot in the hearth. Jed didn't look at the paper. He looked at the rafters above his head, his face turning into a mask of old stone. Silas McCord was my mother's name. My name is Jedediah Silas Coulter. I used the McCord name when I worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad in Denver 3 years ago. I thought it would keep my people out of the trouble. Abby felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind through the logs. Then you are the man my husband was looking for, she said quietly. He wrote a line at the very back of this book. 3 days before his heart failed him, he said, if Vance finds the Denver maps, the ledger won't save me. Find McCord in Redemption Ridge. He has the coordinates. Jed let out a long, slow whistle through his teeth. Your husband was the head clerk for Vance S. Syndicate in Philadelphia. He was the one who cleared the checks for the land grants. He was a man who thought numbers were absolute, Abby said, her fingers tightening on the edge of the leather folder. He believed that if you put a number on a page, it became the truth. But Vance taught him that a bullet can erase a number faster than an ink eraser. She stood up, walking to the small window that looked out toward the timberline. The trees were black against the white snow, their branches heavy and still. I came here because I thought I was answering an advertisement for a husband, she said, her voice carrying that hard, clear rhythm of a person who had finally seen the blueprint of her own trap. I thought some lonely Tio Fu wanted a woman to bake his bread and keep his cabin clean. But Vance didn't send me here to be a bride, Mr. Coulter. He sent me here because he knew I had this ledger. He knew that if I came to Ridgeway looking for Silas McCord, you would either kill me as a spy or I would lead his men straight to your door. Jed swung his good leg off the cot. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his large hands resting on his knees. He looked at her not with the suspicion of a mountain man, but with the grim respect of a soldier looking at another survivor of the same ambush. He underestimated you, Mrs. Mercer, Jed said. His voice was low, steady, the gravel completely gone. He thought you were just an Eastern widow who would sit at the station and cry until someone put her back on the stagecoach. He didn't think you'd walk 4 miles up a mountain in the snow to save a Ga Tio Fu who had just called you old. He didn't know that when a person has lost everything, she stops being afraid of losing her luggage, Abby said. She turned back from the window, her face pale, but her eyes perfectly level. Now, Mr. Coulter, we have 2 halves of a transaction. I have the expenditures, and you have the maps. The question is, what are we going to do with the balance? Jed reached down and touched the third floorboard beneath his cot. We're going to keep the books open, ma'am, until the auditor gets here. The cold did not break. It settled into the wood, turning the green larch logs into iron that groaned whenever the wind hit the mountain from the north. Jed Coulter did not look at his leg. He looked at the floorboards between his feet. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting on his knees like two blocks of unplaned timber. His skin was still gray from the fever, but the wildness had left his eyes. The stone was back. Hand me that pry bar by the hearth. Abby, he said. His voice was a low rumble, keeping time with the wind outside. Abby didn't ask questions. She fetched the iron bar, heavy, hand-forged, rusted at the tip. She stood back and watched. Jed leaned forward, his teeth clicking together as his weight shifted onto his injured calf. He drove the flat end of the iron beneath the third plank from the wood stove. The pine resisted. It had been nailed down with square-headed iron spikes 3 years ago, and the wood had grown around them like a scar around a bullet. He pried. The nail yielded with a dry, screeching groan that sounded like a winter bird dying in the brush. He lifted the plank. Beneath the floor, tucked into the dry dirt between the foundation stones, sat a heavy tin box. It was wrapped in an old wool shirt that had been dipped in tallow to keep out the mountain damp. "Help me get it up," Jed muttered. Abby knelt. She reached into the hole, her fingers brushing against the cold, greasy wool. The earth underneath smelled of old needles and lime, the clean, dead smell of a cellar. She lifted the box and set it on the pine table beside her husband's brown leather folder. Jed didn't open the tin right away. He smoothed his hand over the lid, his calloused thumb rubbing the rusted corner where the solder had begun to pit. "Men from the East think a fortune is something you count in eagles," he said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic cadence of the high country. "They want the yellow dirt from the creek or the paper with the green ink from Washington. They think that's what stays. But out here, ma'am, the federal government owns the sky and the timber barons own the mills. But the man who holds the surveyor's chain holds the truth. If you change a coordinate by 3 degrees on a master map, 5,000 acres of grass become a railroad right-of-way. You wipe out 3 generations of homesteaders with an ink stroke." He unlatched the box. Inside lay 3 rolls of heavy linen paper, the kind used by the United States Department of the Interior for official geological records. They were covered in blue ink and red surveyor S lines, the margins filled with precise mathematical calculations. "These are the original survey plates for the Ridgeway Valley," Jed said, unrolling the largest sheet. He held it flat with his elbows. "Vance engineers drew the route through the northern pass. That S what they filed in Washington. They told the homesteaders down in the valley that the tracks were going 20 miles away, that their grass would be useless for cattle, and that they better sell out for 40 cents an acre before the locomotives bypassed them entirely." Abby leaned over the map. Her eyes tracked the red lines. Her fingers, trained by years of looking at column totals, found the discrepancies instantly. "But the grade is too steep in the north," she said, her voice matching his rhythm. "Look at the contour lines. A steam locomotive couldn't pull 4 cars up that ridge without blowing a cylinder." "Exactly," Jed said. "And a hard?" Winter's smile touched his mouth. "The real line, the only line that can actually be laid, goes straight through the valley floor, right through the property lines of 12 families who have been here since the 69s. Vance bought their deeds for a handful of silver coins, using the fake map to scare them. He's going to sell that same dirt back to the Northern Pacific Railroad next spring for $20 a foot. He tapped a blue ink square in the center of the valley. This cabin sits right on the switchyard, Jed said. Vance offered me $5,000 to sign off on the fake survey when I was in Denver. I told him the mountains didn't move for his checkbook, so he took my name off the payroll, and I took his maps out of the office. Abby touched the corner of the linen sheet. It was stiff, smelling of cedar oil and dried gall ink. In Philadelphia, she said, they call that theft, Mr. Coulter. Out here, Mrs. Mercer, they call it bookkeeping, Jed replied. He looked up at her, his gray eyes level under his heavy brows. Vance uses the law like a club to beat people off their land. A law is only as good as the man who writes it down. If the map is a lie, the deed is a lie. This box isn't gold, but it's the only thing that can give 12 families their lives back. That's the fortune under the floor. It's the right of an honest man to look at his own fence line and know the government can't slide it 5 yards to the west while he's sleeping. He unrolled a smaller slip of paper from the bottom of the tin. It was a letter dated September 1876. The handwriting was small, cramped, and Abby's heart stopped when she saw the signature. James Hayes. Your husband sent me this before he died, Jed said quietly. He knew Vance was coming for the maps. He told me to stay in the brush until he could clear the books on his end. Abby took the paper. The ink was faded, but her husband's voice came through the lines, the dry, cautious voice of a man who had finally found an error he couldn't balance with a pencil. He tried to fix it, she whispered. He tried, Jed said. But out here, when the ledger doesn't balance, they don't hire a new clerk. They just bury the old one. By afternoon, the flurries turned into a steady, gray wall of falling snow that erased the timberline. Abby cleared the table, leaving only the brown leather folder and the tin box side by side under the small grease paper window. She sat with her husband. Ledger open to page 32. Jed sat opposite her, his large hands holding a wooden spoon, stirring a pot of salt pork broth that bubbled on the stove. The cabin had grown small. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people who had looked at the same corpse from opposite sides of the room. Look here, Jed, Abby said. Her finger was flat against the red ink lines. James didn't just record the payments to the development company. He recorded the serial numbers of the bank drafts Vance used to buy the deeds in Ridgeway. Look at the prefix, USM. Jed let the spoon rest against the rim of the pot. Montana Territorial Treasury. Yes, Abby said, her voice dropping into that steady, clear cadence. Vance isn't using his own capital to buy this valley. He is using federal land grant funds meant for the public schools and the territory roads. He is borrowing from the government to cheat the government's own citizens. She turned 3 pages back, her thumb catching on the corner of the parchment. A number on a page is a stubborn thing, she said, looking across the table at him. In the city, my husband used to say that figures didn't have a tongue, but they never told a lie. If you pay a man $10, you have to show where the $10 came from, and you have to show what he gave you for it. Vance thought he could hide the transactions by burying them under 3 different railroad names. But he forgot that every dollar leaves a track in the ink, just like a shod horse in the mud. Jed nodded slowly, his eyes following her fingers as she turned the pages. I can read a trail in the timber, Abby. I know when a bull elk passed through the brush 3 days ago, by the way the twigs are snapped. But I never knew a man could leave his track on a piece of calfskin. They leave it, she said, because greed is a sloppy thing, Mr. Coulter. A thief is always in a hurry. He thinks, because the people he's robbing can't read the ledger isn't watching him. But a public record is a sacred thing. It's the only contract between the weak and the strong that doesn't require a Winchester to enforce it. If you destroy the honesty of the book, you destroy the peace of the country. Jed stood up, his leg moving with less stiffness now. He walked to the hearth, took two small logs of mountain mahogany, and placed them carefully onto the coals. He didn't drop them. He laid them down so they wouldn't spark. Vance's men will be coming up the trail by tomorrow, he said, his back to her. The snow will slow them, but it won't stop them. They know you're here, and they know I'm still breathing. They have got two riders down at Martha's place right now, just watching the stage road. Let them come, Abby said quietly. Jed turned around, his face dark against the firelight. You don't know them, Abby. They aren't the kind of men who talk about contracts. The two assistants Vance brought from Denver, they used to be regulators for the cattle companies in Wyoming. They don't use ink. Abby closed her husband's book with a deliberate, firm click of the iron clasp. My husband was afraid of them his entire life, she said, her voice steady and rhythmic as the falling snow outside. He spent 9 years shaking. Every time Thaddeus Vance walked into his office, he let that fear turn him into an old man before he was 40. He died with his mouth shut, because he thought his silence would keep me safe in Philadelphia. She stood up and walked over to the tin box, her hand resting flat on the cold lid. But his silence didn't keep me safe, she said. It just left me poor, and it left me alone. And it brought me to a town where people laughed at me from across the street. Fear doesn't purchase safety, Mr. Coulter. It only purchases a longer rope for the man who's trying to hang you. I am done being quiet because a man has an expensive coat and 2 guards behind him. Jed looked at her for a long time. The wind hit the south wall of the cabin, making the larch logs creak like the timbers of a ship in a gale. A small sift of white snow blew under the door, remaining on the dirt floor without melting. There's a federal judge down in Helena, Jed said. Name is Marsh, Henry Marsh. He's an old circuit rider who came out here during the gold rush in '63. He is the only man in the territory who doesn't take his tea in Vance's parlor. How far is Helena? Abby asked. 60 miles through the pass, Jed said. 3 days on a good horse. 5 days in this weather. We don't have 5 days, she said. No, Jed said, walking back to the table. He picked up the rolls of linen maps and began to tuck them back into the oilcloth shirt. But Martha's son, Daniel, drives the freight wagon down the valley every Thursday. He's got 4 heavy mules and an iron-rimmed box that locks with a padlock. If we can get these papers into his hands before Vance notices. He paused, his gray eyes locking onto her face. It means you have to go back down to the town, Abby, he said low. Back to the boarding house, back where they're watching. Abby took her black wool cloak from the peg by the door. She shook out the dry pine needles from the collar and wrapped it around her shoulders. I didn't come to Montana to live on a mountain, Mr. Coulter, she said, her voice dropping into that hard, clear cadence that had kept her alive through the winter of her widowhood. I came here to find a life, and if I have to walk through Thaddeus Vance's men to get it, then they had better look to their own ledgers. Because I am coming down the hill, and I am bringing the red ink with me. The snow did not wash the mountain clean. It just hid the rocks until a man stepped on them. Jed Coulter stood by the split-log woodpile outside his cabin. His felling axe swung low against his thigh. His right leg could hold his weight now, though the stitched muscle throbbed like a dull iron bell with every pulse of his blood. He didn't look down at the trail. He listened. The sound came first as a rhythmic crunch, the steady, heavy trudge of a big-boned gelding, lifting its hooves through 12 inches of mountain crust. One horse. Shod, not astray. Thaddeus Vance rode into the clearing alone. He didn't look like a man who had spent 2 hours climbing a timberline trail in an October freeze. His gray broadcloth overcoat was unbuttoned at the neck, revealing a silk cravat the color of dried plums. His buffalo skin gloves were clean. He pulled the reins with his left hand, his right resting casually inside his deep coat pocket. "Coulter," Vance said. His voice was smooth as a river stone. "You look thin. The winter is coming early to the ridge." Jed didn't move the axe. "The winter doesn't care about the calendar, Vance." "Neither do I." "State your business." Vance smiled, but his eyes stayed small and dark under his beaverskin hat. He didn't dismount. He let his horse breathe, the white steam from the animal's nostrils clouding between them. "I came to settle an old account," Vance said, his voice dropping into that easy boardroom cadence. "My agents tell me Mrs. Mercer's staying up here with you. An unconventional arrangement for a Philadelphia widow. But the frontier has always been a place for reinventing one's social status." Jed spit a brown line of tobacco juice into the white snow. "She's keeping the frost out of the kitchen. And she's reading your checkbook, Vance." Vance's hand moved inside his pocket, a soft rustle of paper following the motion. He pulled out a thick linen envelope tied with a string of red hemp. He held it out, not dropping it, waiting for Jed to take the reach. "There is $5,000 in gold certificates in this envelope, Jedediah," Vance said. "That is more money than a timber cutter sees in 3 lifetimes. It is enough to take your boy Thomas out of that rented room in St. Louis and buy him a brick house on the river. It's enough to give him a name that isn't buried in the mud of a railroad ditch." Jed's knuckles went white against the hickory handle of the axe. "And what do you want for the 5,000? "Thaddeus, the tin box under your 3rd floorboard," Vance said, his voice level and cool. "And the brown ledger inside the lady's valise. Give me the records, and Mrs. Mercer takes the tomorrow morning stagecoach back to the railhead. No harm comes to her name. No harm comes to your boy." Jed looked at the linen envelope. The paper was clean, smelling of ink and eastern banks. "In the territories," Jed said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic cadence of a man measuring an acre of timber, "we have a law about contracts, Vance. A man can sell his labor, and he can sell his cattle. That is a legal exchange of property. But when a man tries to sell the truth, he isn't a merchant anymore. He is an outlaw. You think because you have a piece of green paper with a government stamp on it, you can buy the history of this valley. But a human soul isn't a commodity to be listed on the Philadelphia Exchange. If I take your gold, I am telling my boy that his father's honesty had a price tag, and that is a debt he can't ever pay off." Vance's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're an idealist, Coulter. But the railroad doesn't run on ideals. It runs on steel. The government gave my syndicate the land grants because we have the capital to build the state. The small homesteaders down in the valley, they don't have the tools to break this ground. They're just squatters waiting for a market." "They are citizens," Jed said, his axe head dropping an inch until the iron bit into a larch log. "And a citizen has the right to the protection of the book. You maudang my name on that marriage advertisement to bring Abby Mercer out here because you were too cowardly to rob a widow in her own parlor in Philadelphia. You used her like a pack mule to carry her husband's evidence to your door. That isn't progress, Vance. That is just theft with a better coat on." Vance pulled his horse's head around. his face turning into a mask of cold slate. The advertisement was an efficiency, Vance said. She had the book. I needed it. Now she is here, and she is an obstruction. If you don't take the certificates by sundown, my regulators will come up the hill to collect the audit. And they don't carry ink erasers, Coulter. Let them come, Jed said. The mountain has plenty of room for new markers. Vance didn't answer. He cracked his leather quirt against his horse-ass flank, and the big gelding lunged back down the narrow trail, throwing up a spray of frozen crust that rattled against the log walls of the cabin like a handful of gravel. The fire inside the cabin was too hot, but Abby Mercer did not move away from the hearth. She sat on the three-legged stool, her black wool cloak still pinned at her throat, her fingers locked around the handle of her late husband S-Ledger. Jed had come back inside 10 minutes ago. He hadn't dropped his axe by the door. He had set it flat on the table, the sharp edge of the iron pointing toward the window. The silence between them was different now. It had the weight of the gold certificates Vance had offered. He was here, Abby said. Her voice didn't have the city polish anymore. It was hard rhythmic, matching the snap of the mahogany coals. He was here, Jed said. He stood by the water bucket, his bare thumb rubbing the gray skin of his injured calf. He offered $5,000. He wanted the maps, and he wanted James's book. Abby looked down at the gold-embossed cover of the ledger. James died in the winter of '76, Jed. The doctor said it was a dropsy of the heart. He said his lungs filled with fluid because he was a sedentary man who spent too many hours over the ink. I believed him. I spent 2 years thinking my husband died because he didn't have the strength for the city. Jed didn't look at her. He looked out the grease paper window toward the white wall of the forest. James didn't have a dropsy, Abby, Jed said low. His voice was like a heavy stone dragging through the mud. Vance had a man in the house, a cook named Miller. He was on the syndicate payroll for 18 months. He was putting arsenic in James's tea, just enough to make his feet swell. Just enough to keep his breath short so he couldn't walk down to the federal courthouse to file the fraud report. Abby's fingers tightened on the leather until the iron clasp cut into her palm. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. Her chest rose and fell once, a sharp, dry gasp that sounded like cold iron snapping in the frost. You knew, she said. It wasn't a question. I knew, Jed said. I got a letter from James' assistant 3 months after the funeral. He found the receipts for the arsenic in Vance S. private office safe before he ran to Chicago. I kept it to myself, Abby. When you showed up at the station with that valise, I didn't tell you because I thought you were too fragile. I thought if you knew your husband had been murdered for the paper in your hand, you take the next stagecoach back to the railhead and let Vance have the valley. Abby stood up. The stool fell backward onto the dirt floor with a dull thud. She walked straight to him, her face pale as the snow outside, her eyes 2 pieces of gray flint. You thought I was fragile, Mr. Coulter? Her voice dropped into that rhythmic, steady cadence, each word hitting like a hammer on a nail. You thought you had the right to decide how much of my own life I could look at? My husband kept me in the dark for 9 years because he thought his silence was a shield. He thought if I didn't know about the fraud, I wouldn't have to share the blame. And because of his beautiful, cowardly shield, he died alone in a room that smelled of poison, and I spent 2 years begging for sewing work because I didn't know who my enemies were. She struck her hand against the log wall, her knuckles leaving a small drop of red on the rough bark. A man who hides the truth from a woman for her own protection isn't a protector. Jedediah, she said, her voice shaking with a hard, ancient anger. He is just a jailer with a better vocabulary. You took Duat my right to make my own choice. You looked at me at that coach station, and you said, she is an Eastern widow. She cannot handle the blood. You made yourself the judge of my capacity. And that is exactly what Thaddeus Vance does when he decides the homesteaders aren't smart enough to keep their own land. Jed stood perfectly still. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. The red streaks on his leg throbbed beneath his trousers, but he didn't wince. I was afraid for you, Abby, he muttered. Fear is an insult when it's used to buy silence, she said, her voice dropping lower, turning into a whisper that carried more weight than the wind outside. The right to know the truth is a human right, Mr. Coulter. It doesn't belong to the strong, and it doesn't belong to the men who carry the guns. If I am going to be ruined by Thaddeus Vance, I have the right to look him in the face while he does it. I do not need a mountain man to hide the ledger under his floorboards because he thinks my knees will buckle. She turned away from him, unpinned her black cloak, and to pack her extra wool stockings into her valise. Her movements were methodical, fast, and final. Where are you going? Jed asked. I am going down to Martha S. boarding house, Abby said, her valise closing with a sharp clack of the iron latch. Daniels, wagon leaves, for Helena tomorrow morning at dawn. I am going to place this ledger in his iron box myself. I am not going to wait for your permission, and I am not going to wait for your protection. I am a free woman, Mr. Coulter, and it is time I started walking like one. She grabbed the leather handle and pulled the door open. The mountain wind hit her full in the chest, filling the cabin with a white flurry of ice. But Abby Mercer didn't look back. She stepped out into the gray twilight, her boots crunching deep into the crust, leaving Jed standing alone by his cold hearth. The timberline road did not offer comfort. It was just an open throat of gray ice and black pine. Jed Coulter did not follow Abby Mercer immediately. He sat on the three-legged stool by his cold hearth for 30 minutes. The felling axe remained on the table. The iron tip of the bar pointed toward the empty space under the floorboards where the maps had been. He looked at his hands. They were wide, stained with the dark oil of the larch trees, scarred by old slips of the broadaxe. I was trying to keep her safe, he told himself. The words felt thin. They felt like the dry moss a man uses to plug a hole in a rotten log when he doesn't have any good clay left. He stood up. His right calf gave a sharp, hot pull. But he ignored it. He walked to the window. Through the grease paper, the gray twilight had turned into the blue-black of a high mountain night. The wind was hitting the ridge from the north, now, a steady, flat whistle that meant the temperature was dropping toward zero. Yes, I did the same thing Vance did, Jed said to the empty cabin. The sound of his own voice was unpleasant. It lacked the steady cadence he liked. It sounded like a confession made to a circuit preacher after the whiskey had run out. Vance looked at the homesteaders in the valley and said, they are too weak to break this country, so I will take their choices away. Jed looked at Abby Mercer and said, she is too fragile to bear the blood, so I will keep her in the dark. The motive was different. The arrogance was exactly the same. He grabbed his buffalo skin coat. He didn't take the felling axe. He took his short-barreled Colt .44 from the peg behind the door and checked the cylinder by the light of the remaining embers. 6 brass rims. Clean. He slipped it into his waistband and stepped out into the freeze. The 4 dom down the ridge were a lesson in gravity. Jed walked by instinct, his boots finding the frozen crust where Abby's smaller steps had broken the snow. She had slipped twice. He could see the wide, flat marks of her wool cloak where she had hit the bank, and the deep gouges where Her fingers had clawed into the pine needles to haul herself back up. She hadn't turned back. She hadn't waited for the moon. By the time Jed reached the edge of Ridgeway, his boots were frozen stiff, the leather white with hoarfrost. The town was dark, except for the yellow light coming from Martha Prair's kitchen window. A pair of horses stood outside the livery across the road, shod horses, blanketed against the wind, their heads hanging low, Vance riders. They weren't sleeping. They were waiting for the dawn wagon. Jed walked around the back of the boarding house, his boots making no sound on the packed snow of the alley. He let himself in through the lean-to door. The kitchen smelled of lard oil and dried sage. Martha Prair sat by the iron stove, an old woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands holding a cup of chicory coffee that had gone cold. Abby sat across from her. Her black leather ledger was on the table between them. Closed, the iron clasp catching the light from the oil lamp. Her fingers were gray with cold. Jed stepped into the light of the lamp. He took off his beaverskin hat, but remained standing by the door, the frost on his coat melting into small, dark circles on Martha's clean pine floor. "Abby," he said. His voice was rough, the gravel heavy in it. Abby didn't look up from the ledger. "The road is public, Mr. Coulter. You have the right to walk it, but I have nothing more to say about your shields." Jed took 3 steps forward. He didn't look at Martha. He looked at the red spot on Abby Seth's knuckles where she had hit his cabin wall. He knelt on one knee beside her stool, not like a boy asking for a dance at a social, but like a surveyor checking a corner marker that had been misplaced by an old chainman. "I am not here to give you an explanation, Abby," Jed said. His voice dropped into that slow, rhythmic cadence, each word separated by a heavy breath. "I came to tell you that I was wrong. Not because I kept the secret about James, but because I thought I had the authority to measure your capacity." Abby turned her head slowly, her gray eyes reflecting the yellow flame of the lamp. "A man's love out here is a heavy thing, Jedediah," she whispered. "It feels like a log falling across a trail. You can't lift it, and you can't walk around it." "It wasn't love," Jed said, looking straight into her face. "It was the old habit of the frontier. A man comes out here, and he builds a wall out of timber, and he thinks everything inside that wall belongs to his judgment. He thinks because he can handle an axe, he can handle another person's destiny. But a human being's autonomy is a legal right, Mrs. Mercer. It's the same as a deed or a mining claim. It's not something a man can grant or withhold because he's afraid of the weather. If I don't trust you with the truth of your own life, I am treating you like a piece of livestock that needs to be steered into the corral, and I have no right to that brand." Martha Prair let out a dry, rattling cough from the corner. She set her chicory cup down with a sharp clink. "The boy is right, Abby," Martha said, her old voice carrying 30 years of Ridgeway history. "My husband kept the money in his boot for 22 years. He died in the big blizzard of '71, and I spent 3 months looking for his socks because I didn't know how the rent was paid. He thought he was saving me the headache. He just left me with a debt to the company store and no name to sign on the check. A woman who doesn't know the budget is just a tenant in her own kitchen." Abby reached out her hand. She didn't touch Jed's face. She placed her fingers flat on the gold-embossed cover of her husband's book. "I don't forgive you yet, Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and level. "A 9-year habit doesn't wash out with one speech in a kitchen. But I am going to Helena on Daniel S. wagon. And if you are going to stand with me, you had better get your horse, because Thaddeus Vance has 2 riders across the street, and they aren't here to check the ledger." Jed stood up, his leg straight and steady. The horse, is saddled, Abby, and the books are going to be delivered." The dawn did not bring the sun. It brought a gray, greasy light that made the snow look like pewter. Daniel Calhoun's Setsufruit wagon sat in the middle of Ridgeway, S Main Street, the four heavy mules shaking their harnesses until the iron rings jingled in the cold air. Daniel was 35, with a red beard and the thick, stooped shoulders of a man who spent his life lifting barrels of salt pork. He didn't ask questions when Abby Mercer climbed up onto the high box beside him, her black valise tucked between her boots. Jed Coulter sat on his line-back dun horse 10 yards away, his rifle scabbard tucked beneath his leg, his eyes fixed on the office of the Northern Pacific Railroad across the road. The door of the office opened before the team could clear the livery gate. Thaddeus Vance stepped out onto the boardwalk. He didn't have his horse today. He had his two regulators behind him, men with grease-stained leather vests and their low-slung colts unbuckled for the ride. Vance held a white paper in his hand. It wasn't an envelope this time. It was a single sheet of foolscap with a blue territorial seal at the top. "Calhoun," Vance called out. His voice was clear and loud in the empty street. "Hold that team. I have a writ of attachment from the county clerk." Daniel pulled the reins, the mules grunting as they came to a halt in the deep mud. "What's the charge, Mr. Vance?" "I'm carrying federal mail in the boot." "The mail can go," Vance said, walking down the steps into the dirt, his expensive boots sinking up to the ankle, without him seeming to care. He stopped 5 feet from the wagon box, looking up at Abby. "But that leather valise belongs to the estate of James Hayes. The Eastern Montana Development Company has filed a lien against that ledger for theft of proprietary trade secrets. Hand it down, Mrs. Mercer, or the wagon stays in the square." One of the regulators moved to the left, his hand resting on the iron rim of the front wheel. His eyes were small, watery from the cold, looking at Abby's purse. Jed turned his dun horse until the animal's shoulder blocked the regulator from the wheel. He didn't pull his Winchester, but his hand was flat on the horn of his saddle, his face like a piece of river ice. "The county clerk doesn't have jurisdiction over a federal estate, Vance," Jed said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, steady cadence that made the mules quiet down. "An accountant's journal is the personal property of his widow until it is entered into a probate court in Philadelphia. You can't file an attachment on a record that hasn't been verified by an auditor. That writ is nothing but a piece of scrap paper you bought from a drunk deputy for 2 bits. Vance didn't look at Jed. He kept his eyes on Abby's face. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a smaller, yellowed letter. The paper was thin, torn at the corner, covered in James Hayes' spidery handwriting. "I have this, Mrs. Mercer," Vance said, his voice dropping into a soft, confidential purr that was louder than a shout. "This is from your husband, written 3 weeks before his heart failed. He knew he was caught. He wrote to me, begging for an accommodation. He said, take the coordinates, take the ledger lines, but leave Abigail out of the warrant. She has no knowledge of the figures. He bartered his own name to keep you from the prison, ma'am. If you take that book to Helena, you are telling the federal judge that James Hayes was a co-conspirator in a land fraud. You are digging up his grave to hang his memory." The street went completely quiet. A crow called out from the top of the livery barn, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the frost. Abby looked at the yellow letter in Vance's hand. She recognized the ink. She recognized the neat, fearful slant of the letters. It was the handwriting of a man who had spent his whole life trying to balance a column so he wouldn't have to look at the world outside his window. She reached into her valise. She didn't pull out the ledger. She took the white candle she had brought from Martha's kitchen and a match from her cloak pocket. She struck the match against the iron rim of the wagon seat. The sulfur flame flickered blue, then bright yellow against the gray mist. She touched the fire to the wick of the candle. Then, with her left hand, she took the yellow letter from Vance. Fingers, he let her take it, thinking she was going to press it to her heart. She didn't press it. She held the corner of her husband's letter directly into the candle flame. The old paper caught instantly. It burned with a clear, hot light, the spidery ink shriveling into black ash that the mountain wind caught and scattered across the gray mud of Ridgeway Street. "Abigail," Vance hissed, his hand reaching for the reins of the mules. "That was your evidence of his love." Abby Mercer looked down at him from the high box, her face perfectly still, her voice carrying that hard, rhythmic cadence of a person who had finally stepped out of her cage. "My husband loved me like a prisoner loves his blanket, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear enough for every man on the livery porch to hear. "He thought if he kept me warm and cold, I wouldn't notice the bars. He was a coward when he was alive, and he was a coward when he wrote that letter. He thought he could buy my safety by making a treaty with the man who was poisoning his tea. But a human life cannot be protected by a compromise with a thief. I am not going to hide his memory under a lie. If he was a criminal, let the judge write it down in the federal record. But his book is going to Helena, and I am the one who is going to sign the verification." She looked back at Jed Coulter. He was looking at her, and for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach, there was no pity in his face. There was only the wide, clean space of the high country. "Drive on, Daniel," Abby said. The whip cracked. The 4 heavy mules lunged into the collars, the iron wheels grinding through the mud, leaving Thaddeus Vance standing in the street with nothing but a handful of gray ash between his clean fingers. The federal law did not arrive on a black horse with a smoking gun. It arrived in a 2-seat Democrat wagon, covered in 90 miles of yellow Montana dust. Judge Henry Marsh did not look like a man who held the authority of the United States government in his briefcase. He was 70, with a beard, like an old horsehair mattress, and a black wool coat that had gone green at the shoulders from 30 years of mountain rain. He climbed down in front of Martha, Press boarding house, took a plug of tobacco from his waistcoat, and looked at the valley. "The grade is fine," he said to Jed Coulter, who stood by the hitching post. "A locomotive will do 30 miles an hour through this grass if the deeds are clean." The hearing did not take place in a courthouse. Ridgeway didn't have one. It took place on the long pine table in Martha S. dining room, under the yellow light of 3 kerosene lamps. Thaddeus Vance sat on the eastern side of the table. He had his lawyers from Helena now, men with gold watch chains and trousers that didn't have mud on the cuffs. His 2 regulators were gone. The federal marshals had taken their colts at the town line. Vance looked at the table, his face smooth, his hands resting on his knees, like an old gambler waiting for the next deal. Abby Mercer sat opposite him. Her black leather ledger was open to page 40. Beside it lay Jedis rolls of blue-inked linen maps, held flat at the corners by 4 heavy iron flatterens Martha used for the shirts. Judge Marsh didn't use a gavel. He used his pocket knife, tapping the horn handle against the pine boards until the room went quiet. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice a low, dry rasp like a shovel, sliding into gravel. "The United States territorial courts are not here to regulate the ambitions of the railroad syndicates. We are here to enforce the baseline of the public contract. I have looked at the Department of the Interior survey plates from '74. and I have looked at the coordinates you filed in Washington last spring. He pointed a long yellow fingernail at the blue square on Jed's map. The maps you filed are an absolute fabrication, Judge Marsh said. You moved the line 20 miles north on paper, so you could force 12 families to surrender their titles under duress. That is not an efficiency of capital, sir. That is a felony against the United States Treasury. Vance's lawyer stood up, his hand reaching for his vest pocket. Your Honor, the development company has expended $40,000 in infrastructure. The development company has expended $40,000 of the public school land grant funds, Abby Mercer said. Her voice didn't shake. It had that steady, rhythmic cadence of the ledger lines, each word hitting like a hammer on a cold nail. She turned the book toward the judge, her thumb resting against a column of red figures. A land grant is a public trust, Judge Marsh, she said, looking straight into Vance's dark eyes. In the Constitution, the government gives land to the territories for one purpose: to build schools and roads for the common benefit of the citizens. It is a collective capital, not a private purse. When Mr. Vance took those treasury drafts to buy the private deeds of this valley, he was committing a double theft. He was robbing the homesteaders of their past labor, and he was robbing the children of this territory of their future education. A public fund is not an investment pool for a thief with a clean shirt. Vance leaned forward, his face turning the color of old lard under the lamp oil. The valley would have rotted without my tracks, Mrs. Mercer. Those people don't know how to use the ground. They know how to bleed for it, Jed Coulter said from the door. He didn't pull his Colt. He just stood there, his shoulder resting against the larch doorframe, his gray eyes level. The law doesn't measure a man's right to his fence line by his intelligence, Vance, Jed said, his voice dropping into that slow mountain rhythm. A deed is a legal recognition of a man's sovereignty over his own sweat. If he wants to grow nothing but wild rye and thistle on his patch, that is his prerogative as a free citizen. You don't get to slide his boundary lines because you think you can grow a better crop of dollars. The law isn't an engine for your progress. It's a shield for his peace. Judge Marsh didn't ask for a rebuttal. He closed his pocket knife with a sharp, heavy snap that ended the conversation. The titles are reverted, the judge said. The Helena grand jury has already issued the warrants for the financial officers of the Eastern Montana Development Company. Mr. Vance, you will remain in the custody of the marshal until the circuit court sits in November. The books for this valley are closed. Vance stood up. He didn't look at his lawyers. He looked at Abby Mercer, at the ink on her fingers, the gray wool of her traveling dress, the absolute stillness of her face. You have ruined a $40,000 enterprise. Guafu, he said low. No, Mr. Vance, Abby said, closing her husband's ledger with a firm click of the iron clasp. I have just balanced the ledger, and the balance is zero. The spring of 1879 did not arrive with flowers. It arrived with the smell of wet earth and the sound of 12 felling axes working at the same time down in the valley floor. The Ridgeway Valley population grew to 295 people by May. The families who had packed their wagons to leave came back through the pass, their mules lean, but their eyes wide, as they looked at their old fence lines. The railroad was still coming, the real railroad, laid along the flat grade Jed Coulter had measured 3 years ago. But this time, the company paid $20 a foot to the men who owned the grass. The cabin, 4 miles up the timberline, remained. Jed Coulter sat on the top rail of his split-log corral, watching his line-back dun horse crop the new green rye. His right leg didn't throb anymore. The scar was a thick silver line that had gone hard, like the grain of an old larch tree. He had a letter in his shirt pocket. It had come on the Thursday stage from St. Louis. The handwriting was big, unformed, the lines crooked on the cheap paper. "Dear Father," it said, "the school here is fine. Grandma says the river is high this month. I have kept the buckskin gloves you sent. I think I would like to see the mountain when the snow goes off." Jed didn't put the letter in his drawer. He kept it in his pocket, where the paper grew soft from the heat of his own chest. Abby Mercer did not live on the mountain. She lived in the small room on the second floor of Martha Prayer Boarding House, the room with the unchinked logs in the corner that she had plugged herself with clean gray clay from the creek. She had a small shingle hung outside the front door. A. Mercer, Notary Public and Legal Clerk. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the kitchen table at Martha S. was cleared of the cabbage pots. The homesteaders came in, men with skin like cedar bark and women with babies wrapped in old wool shawls. They didn't bring gold. They brought a bucket of fresh butter, a side of salted venison, or 3 dozen larch shingles for her roof. Abby sat at the head of the table with a new bottle of blackgall ink and a steel-nibbed pen. She didn't write poetry. She read deeds. "Look here, John," she said to an old German homesteader who couldn't read the English print on his new railroad clearance. Her voice had the steady, rhythmic cadence of the valley, now short sentences, long pauses, keeping time with the breathing of the people across from her. She pointed her pen at the small print at the bottom of the parchment. "A contract is not a mystery, John," she said to him. "It's just a record of what you gave and what you took. The railroad has the right to lay the steel 50 feet from your barn. That is what you sold them. But they do not have the right to use your creek for the boilers without an additional lease. If a man tells you the law requires you to give up your water for the locomotive, he is lying to you. The law is not an invisible hand that takes your things while you aren't looking. It is a public text. It is written down so that a man who can't read the words can still hold the paper in his hand and know his boundaries are secure." The German homesteader nodded, his large, callous thumb tracing the line of her pen. "Danke, Mrs. Mercer." "You're welcome, John," she said. "That will be 6 eggs for the ledger." The sun went down behind the Rocky Mountains at 6 o'clock, throwing a long red shadow across the Ridgeway Main Street that looked like a line of cedar ink. Jed Coulter rode his dun horse down from the Timberline Trail, his rifle scabbard empty today, his beaver skin hat tucked into his saddle string. He tied the horse to the post outside Martha S. and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Abby was sitting on the bench, her black wool cloak wrapped around her knees against the evening chill. Her black journal lay. On her lap, the pages, nearly full now, covered in the neat columns of the valley's new history. Jed didn't sit down beside her. He leaned his shoulder against the porch post, looking out locomotive headlight, was visible 20 miles away. In the mist, a tiny, yellow eye moving through the grass. "Daniel says the freight rates are dropping next week," Jed said. His voice was a low rumble, keeping time with the jingle of his spurs. "They should," Abby said, without looking up from her book. "The competition through the pass is open now. Vance's monopoly is broken." "You're staying?" he asked. Abby closed the journal with a soft, deliberate thud. She looked at his face, at the gray eyes that had stopped looking for an ambush, at the large hand that rested flat against the pine post without trembling. "There is work here, Mr. Coulter," she said, her voice dropping into that hard, clear cadence of a person who had finally found her own coordinate. The valley needs people who can read the small print, and I have $12 left in my purse. That is enough for 6 weeks of salt pork if I don't eat much." Jed looked at the yellow locomotive eye in the distance. "Martha has that cabin behind the livery," he said low. "The one with the stone chimney and the cedar floor. It's just got 2 rooms. It's as dry." "Is that an advertisement, Jedediah?" she asked, a small winter smile touching the corner of her mouth. "It's a transaction, Abby," Jed said, turning his face to look at her straight. "A fair exchange between 2 people who have seen the bottom of the box. I have the timber. You have the ink. We don't need any more shields between us." Abby Mercer stood up, her hand holding her black book tight against her side. She stepped off the porch planks into the dirt road, her head held high in the Montana twilight, her boots finding the steady rhythm of the ground. "The cabin will do, Mr. Kilter," she said, "but we'll keep the ledger open. Every single line. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities."
That is the promise Abigail Mercer carried off the stagecoach platform with mud on her boots and $12 in her purse, and it is the promise she kept through a Montana winter that would have broken a lesser person into kindling. She did not arrive in Ridgeway as a heroine. She arrived as a woman who had been used by a dead husband who hid the truth to protect her, by a living villain who shipped her across the country like a parcel containing her own destruction, and by a mountain man who looked at her fine-boned eastern hands and decided, before she had spoken a dozen words, that she was too fragile to carry the weight of her own life. She arrived with nothing but a leather journal, a steel-nibbed pen, and the unshakable habit of counting everything precisely. And it was that habit, the accountant's wife who had learned to read numbers as other people read faces, that dismantled Thaddeus Vance's empire. Not a gun, not a badge, not a cavalry charge through the mountain pass, a ledger and the courage to sign it in open court. This story is, at its heart, about one of the oldest and most persistent lies ever told to a woman by a man who believed he loved her. The lie sounds like this: "I am keeping this from you to protect you." James Hayes whispered it with his last breath, negotiating a coward's treaty with the man who was poisoning his tea. Jedediah Coulter carried it in his chest for 3 days, choosing Abby's ignorance over her autonomy because her face, at the stagecoach platform, looked like something he was afraid to break. Both men called it love. Both men were wrong. Because the thing they were actually protecting was not Abby. It was themselves, from the pain of watching her face when the truth arrived. They wrapped their fear in the language of tenderness, and they handed her a beautiful cage and called it a shelter. Abby named it precisely. A man who hides the truth from a woman for her own protection is not a protector. He is a jailer with a better vocabulary. That is perhaps the sharpest lesson this story drives into the frozen Montana ground. The right to know the truth about your own life is not a reward for being strong enough, or educated enough, or calm enough. It is not something another person can grant you on the days they feel generous, or withhold on the days they decide you cannot handle it. It is the most fundamental human right of all. It is the right that makes every other right possible. The right to choose, the right to resist, the right to walk into a courtroom and sign your name on a document that will ruin a $40,000 enterprise because the books do not balance. Without the truth, a person cannot make a real choice. They can only walk the path someone else decided was safe for them. And as Abby knew in her bones, from 9 years of a marriage that polished her like furniture and consulted her like a houseplant, a life lived inside someone else's idea of your capacity is not a life. It is a very comfortable captivity. But this story does not leave us only with Abby's fierce, ironclad clarity. It also leaves us with Jed Coulter on his knees in Martha Prayer's kitchen, not asking for forgiveness, but doing something harder, naming the mechanism of his own arrogance out loud. He looked at his hands, the hands that could read the timber and track a bull elk through the brush, and admitted that he had done to Abby precisely what Vance did to the homesteaders. He decided she was not capable enough to keep her own land. He moved her boundary lines without asking. A man who does that with a survey chain is a criminal. A man who does it with silence and good intentions is still a man who moved the line. What this valley ultimately builds itself on is not the railroad and not the water table beneath the relay station. It is something far older and more necessary than both. It is the public record, the ledger that belongs to everyone, the deed that stands whether you can read it or not, because it is written in a language the law has promised to protect. Abby Mercer sat at Martha's kitchen table every Tuesday and Thursday and taught homesteaders with cedar bark skin how to hold a piece of paper and know that their fence line was secure. Not because she trusted the government and not because she trusted the railroad, but because she trusted the ink. She trusted the permanence of a number written down in daylight by a person willing to sign their name to it. In a world where the powerful spend their lives finding new ways to steal from the unlettered, a woman with a steel-nibbed pen and the courage to read the small print out loud is the most dangerous thing on the frontier. The locomotive's yellow eye moved through the valley grass 20 miles away, and it was coming regardless. Progress always does. But this time, it was going to arrive and find the land already spoken for. Not by a syndicate with forged maps, but by 12 families who knew to the precise legal foot exactly what they had sold and what they had kept. The ledger was open, every single line, and that was enough to build a life on.